Apologies if you can hear the main road or the washing machine or next door shouting, this is just how I live. The Elder Scrolls is a game series that has been around for 27 years. In that time there have been 5 main title releases, several smaller spin-off games and one huge MMORPG, as well as the books that take place within the established universe, and as a result all of these sources have produced a vast amount of lore which goes back thousands of years to the very beginning of time. But given the fact that Elder Scrolls games are always in the genre of action or adventure or RPG or thereabouts, they rarely explore the diegetic music known to the inhabitants of Tamriel, which is the main continent the games take place on. It's a series about creating a character and forging your own path in the world, usually through the use of weaponry or magic, and this means that there is almost no focus on the art or music produced by the people of the world, except for world building and immersion purposes. For example, in one of the games you might walk into an inn and find that there's a bard ambiently playing in the corner, and you can ask him to play a song and the bard will offer some spoken flavour text like this.
I am trained in the 3 traditional bardic instruments, lute, drum, and flute.
But this doesn't really tell us anything about this bard's musical culture as a whole. Are these the only instruments they play? If so, why? What musical form are they using and who are the great composers of their culture? Unfortunately, lots of this information just isn't answered in any of the games or out-of-game sources, so for this project I'll be picking 2 or 3 of the 10 races that you can play as in the games, researching their cultures and the real-world cultures that influence their creation, and using this research to try to compose original music from the viewpoint of a composer belonging to each of my chosen races. I hope you brought your wellies because we're starting in the swamps. The Argonians are a race of lizard-like humanoids that inhabit the province of Black Marsh. It's a dense swampland region in the southeast of Tamriel, which is home to innumerable dangerous flora and fauna, including a race of sapient trees called the Hist, who are basically seen as gods by the Argonians. The Argonian culture as a whole seems to be heavily inspired by the Aztec civilization, which becomes apparent when we compare their clothing, their weaponry, environment, and even historical interactions with invasive civilizations. The Aztec civilization is known for commonly depicting drums and wind instruments in their art, but they seemingly never developed stringed instruments, at least until the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Likewise, this note found in the Elder Scrolls Online bolsters the idea that Argonian instruments might be similar to the ones found in the Aztec culture, giving mention to drums and clay flutes, so given these similarities in instrumental availability and usage, and of course the aforementioned non-musical influences from Mesoamerica, I think it's fair to use what we know about Aztec music as a basis for Argonian music. So, the Argonians have clay flutes and probably clay ocarinas too, since they were common in Aztec music. They also have an extensive collection of percussion instruments as documented in the music lore article by the unofficial Elder Scrolls Pages wiki. Stringed instruments are notably absent in the Argonian culture, so we can't use any of them in the composition. But the most well-known Argonian instrument is this absolute horse of a thing, the Vossa Sartler, whose name I can't pronounce properly. This is essentially a piano-sized bagpipe with chambers containing frogs that croak to the music, and it sounds like this. Taking cues from these known Argonian instruments, I've invented a few more to use in my composition. Firstly, the main melody in the first part of the piece is played by a flute that I'm calling the Marsh Robin flute, which is used to mimic the call of a songbird native to Black Marsh, the marsh robin. The call repeats several times in the piece, and towards the end a response call is played by a second flute. The second instrument I invented is the frog drum, which is similar to the Vossa from earlier. I imagine it to be a large metal drum with a chamber inside it that's insulated by mud so the frog doesn't die from the pure loudness inside. And for the third instrument, I'm basically picturing wind blowing through a hist tree, which are the large sentient trees that can communicate with Argonians. So basically the hist tree morphs itself into what is essentially a big hollow resonation chamber, and it directs air in using its branches and leaves, resulting in a big haunting, windy and woody sound, kinda like a mix between an organ and a marimba, which is a really weird mix to describe, but I think it works here. In music from the Aztec civilization, rhythms were constructed using drum syllables. There were 2 low syllables called to and ko, which represented a low upbeat and a low downbeat note, respectively, and there were 2 high syllables called ti and ki, which represented a high upbeat and downbeat. This basically meant that all rhythms were made up of a combination of crotchets and quavers using 2 notes. For example, I have used the drum syllables system as a basis for my Argonian percussion parts. By using Aztec-influenced rhythms, a bird call-like melody, and all the Argonian-inspired instruments, this piece tries to evoke the ancient swampland imagery of Black Marsh, and hopefully gives off a very natural, yet alien sound, especially in the first piece, which is called Saxhleel, which means people of the root. Here it is. To the north of Black Marsh is the province of Morrowind, which is home of the Dark Elves, also known as the Dunmer. Morrowind is a volcanic place with large areas of ashlands, forests of giant mushrooms and strange creatures found nowhere else, and in a 2001 interview with the developers of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, just before the game came out, they said the province is modelled after the Middle East and early Japan, among other influences. We can see these influences when we look at their architecture. The Dark Elves also have a system of great houses which I find quite reminiscent of the government of ancient China during the Warring States period. There is also a minority of Dark Elf society who don't live in the cities called the Ashlanders, whose way of life is very similar to the Mongolian nomadic tradition. So Dunmer culture ends up being a bit of a melting pot of the Middle East and Mesopotamia, ancient Chinese tradition, early Japanese and Mongolian nomadic tradition. As it happens, the instruments shown to us in the lore of the game match up with these cultures quite well. In the game The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind we can find this lute, which looks to be along the lines of long-necked lutes found commonly in folk traditions from the Middle East, such as the Persian tar and setar, and the dramian, which is a very cool instrument from Himalayan folk tradition. The Dark Elves are known to make flutes out of the limbs of quama, which are large insectoid creatures found in Morrowind, and these flutes are said to produce a fairly limited range of notes, suggesting that the musical scales used must be fairly limiting too, perhaps along the lines of a 5-note scale like the pentatonic, rather than a 7-note scale like major or minor. The Dark Elves also have drums and percussion, notably drums with basses made from the back teeth of bull alits, which are said to be acoustically impressive and deep sounding. These might be similar to Western concert timpanis, but could alternatively be more like the Persian drum known as a dohol. Another Dunmer drum is this fairly standard looking conical drum, and as for other percussion instruments, the Dark Elves have gongs and hammering bells that are played with huge hammers, both of which are of clear Chinese influence. And one final instrument to mention is the horsehead fiddle, which is an iconic bowed-stringed instrument from Mongolia. There is no direct evidence for the Dark Elves using these, but given how influential the Mongolian nomadic culture is on the Ashlander tribes of Dunmer, this instrument would fit perfectly there. There is a lot of potential for cultural interchange between the Argonians and the Dunmer, not only due to the fact that they border each other, but also because they have always interacted historically, albeit usually in a hostile way. In particular, in some parts of Dunmer society, the slavery of lesser races has become a fully fledged tradition, and due to their close proximity, it was always easiest to enslave the Argonians. This may have led to instruments being shared between the two races, for example the Argonian slave drums, which were used by the lizard folk to communicate and organise slave revolts in their camps. I like to think that once the guards realised the drums were the cause of the problem, they would have confiscated them, and eventually the drums disseminated throughout the country, becoming a common instrument in Dunmer music, but with minor differences like changing the construction materials or the patterns. I took this into account when I decided what instruments to use. And now we'll move on to the composition itself. For a long time the Dark Elves worshipped three gods, collectively called the Tribunal, though they have fallen out of favour now. Their names were Almalexia, Sofasil, and Vivek, and they were sometimes abbreviated to ALMSIVI, which is the name of my piece. My composition has a theme of using threes. It has 3 sections. The final section is in 6/8, a triple time signature. There are 9 instruments in the piece, which is 3 threes, and one of the recurring techniques in the melody instruments is the use of triplet arpeggios. This is obviously all in reference to the Tribunal. The 9 instruments I used are broken up like this. The 2 melody instruments are a Dunmer lute and a pentatonic quamalim flute. Based off of the Mongolian horsehead fiddle, I created a strider-head fiddle, which is named after the giant silt striders of Morrowind that are used for transport. It is mainly used chordally. There are 2 pieces of tuned percussion, the Hlalu gong of Great House Hlalu, and the Dunmer hammer bells, which are based off of Balinese gamelan bells. The drums are the biggest section, including 4 instruments: the Dunmer conical drum, the Bull Alit teeth drum, the Argonian slave drum, which has been repurposed and given a guar drum skin, and following this idea, I used the Argonian frog drum from the other compositions and thought that the Dark Elves might have taken the frogs out and replaced them with a thin layer of coarse ash, changing the croaky sound to a more snare-like sound. This shows how the 2 cultures can affect each other's traditions inadvertently, despite usually being hostile to one another. And with that context out of the way, here is my Dunmer composition, ALMSIVI. And with that, our exploration into two fictional musical cultures is complete. I hope you enjoyed learning about these two very interesting peoples and hearing my interpretation of their music. I certainly did. Thanks for watching, and bye bye.